Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. In the 1950s, George Reeves embodied the Man of Steel in Superman's first television adaptation, from its gritty black and white beginnings to the kid-friendly color years. To this day, an entire generation reveres George as their Superman, while for others, the show remains an overlooked chapter in the character's mythology. On this podcast, we bring everyone together as we break down each episode of Adventures of Superman. Welcome to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 2, Episode 7, Superman in Exile, is the editor-in-chief of 13thdimension.com, returning guest, Dan Greenfield. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
It's great to have you here in studio. So before we get into this episode in particular, your feelings on Season 2 overall and the shift that we see in this season?
Yeah, I actually prefer Season 1 to Season 2. The kind of more rough-edged, noirish feelings and some of the unhinged elements of Season 1 where they really, I think of Mystery in Wax being a good example where they really push the envelope and some of the really pulpy feel of episodes like Drums of Death and that, they don't necessarily hold up today in terms of them being, politically palatable. But they're still of their time, and they, there's certainly an entertainment value there. I think in the second season, it's a little, it's the things I also liked Phyllis Coates as Lois Lane. It's not that I'm against Noel Neill, but Noel Neill's arrival really lightened a lot of the proceedings and made she didn't make the show comic, but the relationship between Lois, Jimmy, and Clark has more of a lighthearted comedic feel than it did in the first season. So I think that that's a shift as far as I can go, as far as I can, consider. I think that the second season goes a little bit farther, the dog who knew Superman and all that kind of stuff. But it's still great. I mean, I really, I appreciate the color episodes because it's, colorful. It's Superman in his, red, blue, and gold outfit and all that stuff, and it has a lot to recommend it. But the episodes that I find that I want to watch over and over are the black and white episodes, mostly Season 1, but there's also a lot of really good stuff in Season 2. And of course, in Season 2, some of the all-time great episodes, like, Panic in the Sky is in Season 2. And the two, the two that I've watched recently, we're, doing an episode here on Superman in Exile. For me, there's a lot that recommends that episode and really it's of its time. But it's fun and it's got some really good whiz bang action, which you sometimes don't always necessarily equate with the show because it's usually against, mobsters and stuff. But here you get some science fiction thrown in. It's a kick. So yeah, no, I like this whole period.
Right on. Speaking of Season 1, one of the episodes you did with us was the standout episode, The Stolen Costume.
Yeah.
And just as a little bit of a connection point, as you and I discussed at great length, Superman takes the villains who have discovered his secret identity to this cabin in the mountains.
Where he murdered them.
Well, the jury's still out on that one. At a minimum, he took matters into his own hands in a way that perhaps he shouldn't have, whether or not he was ultimately responsible.
As we discussed at the time, and as people have been debating for, 70 years or whatever it's been.
But that mountain cabin, now here we are in Season 2, and a couple episodes ago, we had the Jet Ace episode where Perry White's nephew holes up at this cabin in the mountains that ends up getting burned.
Right.
And now in this episode, which we'll get into, Superman sequesters himself when he's radioactive in this cabin in the mountains.
Right.
It's a thing.
Yes. Yes, yes. The snow-capped mountains outside of Metropolis, New York.
Yes.
Yes, as we know, living outside of Metropolis, New York, that this place is a mountain range much like the Rockies. So it's yes, snow-capped mountains and log cabins, in far away places. Yes, this is very much a thing.
We don't have the Fortress of Solitude, but we have
no, but we have
this.
We have the cabin in the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite the budget for these cabins out there. So Superman in Exile aired October 31st, 1953, written by Jackson Gillis, directed by Tommy Carr. My synopsis: Superman becomes radioactive, seemingly forever, after he averts a nuclear meltdown, then sequesters himself in a cabin in the mountains. When Lois is taken aboard a hijacked plane, Superman tests a theory and allows himself to be struck by the lightning, with the shock from the electricity curing him in time to save Lois. Now, I want to ask you your overall impressions, but to tee us up for that, we have really more of a comment from one of our patrons, Mike Thomas, who says, "This episode always stood out in my memory. It breaks the formula of the series in a few ways. We see Superman rather than Clark for most of the episode, which is unusual. Also, the idea of Superman in Exile is really cool. I guess Superman has a cabin outside Metropolis as a Fortress of Solitude, like we just said. The vibe of this episode is a nice change of pace and feels like a fun Silver Age comic book story." So that was Mike's take on the episode. Yeah, I mean, overall, how did you feel about this one?
I liked it a lot right from the jump. I hadn't picked up on the fact that there isn't quite as much Clark, but it makes sense. There's a few reasons why I like it, but right from the opening sequence where you see this big cinder block thing with pipes and, flames and firecracker sounds. And it's just this, it looks great. I mean, it's really rudimentary for special effects, but it's and it's like this really intimidating looking thing. And of course, it's got no basis in reality in terms of what a nuclear reactor would look like, and they don't even at the beginning, they call it Project X that this is, and it's not entirely clear from the very beginning that this is a nuclear facility of some kind. Of that comes out as it goes. And, because what exactly their experiment isn't entirely clear, but you've got a bunch of baffled scientists, and of course the machine is ready, nearing meltdown, and the humans in their really not at all effective hazmat suits going in to try to shut it down, and of course that doesn't work. So Superman hears about it. They're listening on the radio at the planet, and he comes in, and he's very I would almost say haughty. In the sense that they're like, "Oh, you can't go in there." Like, "Well, I'm Superman. I can go." And he go, and it's great. They've got the big door, because they've got that kind of airlock area. He goes in, and it's just George Reeves wordlessly, basically hamming it up, where he's trying to get close to it, and he's fighting back, and he's being pushed back by the winds and the flame. And then he finally fixes what needs to be fixed, and things calm down. But what I love about it is, like, I actually said to myself, okay, this is 70 years ago, thereabouts. How did they pull that off? Because there's flame all over and near where he is, and yet he doesn't hesitate. It's not a stunt man. It's George Reeves in there, and his cape could go up at any second. And so I really did wonder how they, I know that, the old line of smoke and mirrors, but I'm like, how did they actually pull that off? Because it really looks dangerous. But I really like that whole setup. It's very basic. It doesn't, the science is total hokum. But I do appreciate the fact that the scientist he saved was filled with gamma rays, which was a great a prequel that never was, because, wouldn't it have been great if Superman, battled the Hulk here, years before the Hulk debuted? When you have a scientist filled with gamma rays, we all know what happens next. But the idea that he's so weakened, and then of course the payoff is that he starts to glow. And it's, again, rudimentary special effects, but it looks really cool. And it's really, as opposed, it's not a particularly complicated plot. It's not it doesn't really take much to, it's pretty straightforward. Superman becomes radiation poisoned and he has to go away until he can figure out how not to be radiated anymore. And that's really it. But it's the use of the special effects. It's the use of all of that kind of, wacky mad scientist stuff that I love, that I find it a really entertaining episode.
Yeah, I think that whole sequence that you were just describing was tremendously effective, and credit to George Reeves because, like you said, just this wordless physical acting as he's in that chamber, and you buy it. The thing is, you really see him sweating, literally and figuratively.
Yes,
right. Like you could see the sweat on his costume, but to see Superman really working against this, and he committed to it, and it really sold it, right? Because regardless of whether or not the science of this checks out, you buy into it. Like he makes you buy into it. Right. He makes you buy into the stakes and the threat of this. Yep. I'll say, I thought this had an absolutely great setup. This episode had a great setup and really created an avenue for some genuine pathos, because you do see the character challenged in a different way. And there are these moments when he's sequestered where he's reading the books that the scientist is sending him. And even earlier than that, when he goes outside and you see him irradiated and he just kind of hangs his head. Yeah. Right? Like you see him, there's a weariness to him that I don't know that we've really seen before. So I thought the setup to this was great, but I just didn't feel like there was a compelling payoff to it.
I'll buy that because it lapses very quickly into your more standard, Superman versus local mugs type characters, and with an unnecessarily convoluted reason to kidnap Lois Lane and all of that. But the setup works really well. The glowing effect works. I think his frustration and his anxiety come out, that I think it's not a part of Superman that you typically see. The scene where he sees, I think he's at the mountaintop and he's sitting outside and he's looking over the city and there's nothing he can do to help. And he just kind of looks at his hands and he just kind of hangs his head. He's Superman is, in his own way for the moment, has been defeated. And you didn't typically see that sort of thing. But what I at that point, yes, it's if not a tonal shift, there's a definite, the plot takes a right turn. We get the criminals coming in, including a character actor who we later saw in Star Trek and have seen in other things. And, basically there's this really weird back and forth with this guy who's trying to sell a story or pitch a story about these jewels, and yet he also is involved with criminals. And if you think too hard about it, it's like, I'm not really sure I'm following all of this, but that's okay. And then you have to have Superman have to find a way to, obviously he's got to have a challenge in front of him. And even though I think he even says like the jewels are it was Lois. I think the jewels are the last thing on our mind right now, but somehow, Superman feels, he's got to do what he's got to do. It kind of slows down after that, but I liked it because the scenes of him pacing the cabin, George Reeves did a great frustrated Superman and a frustrated Clark Kent. For all of his easygoing charm that you would see, when he got agitated, he was kind of a dick, and he is kind of a dick in this episode. He's like, give me a Geiger counter. He has no patience. And I like that he keeps, trying to test whether he's radioactive by going up to the flowers in the flower pots and, using reverse motion, filming. They look like they're wilting under his, all of that stuff I think is fine. And you're, of course, as a viewer, you're relating to his isolation, the boredom, the like I said, his impotence in terms of being able to actually do something and having to wait it out. But I think it picks up right again when he has that epiphany where he realizes after the scientist had told him, you need some kind of shock to the system. And he's like, lightning. And of course, none of this works. None of this matters. But that's really cool where you actually get to see him flying and you see the lightning bolts. And then anytime, you've got the big airplane set where he's like grabbing the plane from behind. And so I think that Yeah, there's a little bit of a drag in the middle, but I think it starts extremely strongly, and I think that there's a really good solid payoff at the end.
Oh, fair enough. I'll also say I agree with you. I mean, one of the things I love about this incarnation of the character and George's performance is that frustration and impatience that he displays.
Oh, yeah.
What's particularly interesting here is that it's a different shade of it because, yes, he is annoyed, but there is this larger question and threat and problem hanging over him. So it takes on a different dynamic, and I love the way he plays it. So, yeah, it's that frustrated Clark, but the stakes are different in this one. So I really liked that. And
it's also very Superman of the era and Superman in general, is that at no time does it seem like his anguish is over the fact that he could die. It's that he can't help anybody else.
Yeah.
And that's his raison d'etre. That's what that is what he lives for. This is what he does. So he's isolated, and it's not like he's feeling sorry for himself in that regard. It's more about like, how am I supposed to go on as Superman if I can't help people? And that theme and the way he carries that across also reminds you of his heroism. And this is one of Superman's biggest challenges we've seen. And I think that is effectively portrayed.
No, fair enough. Again, I think when we talk about that turn where it kind of veers into more of the standard kind of episode and villain plot, that's where I'm just like, oh, I wanted a little bit more here. And look, it's probably not fair to hold this up to Panic in the Sky, which most consider the best of the series, but similar type of thing where he's got to get it together in time. Mm-hmm. But there you have such a thrilling climax. And here I felt like there was more that maybe could have been done, but the setup to it was great. His performance was amazing. And yeah, just to see the character put in this position was really kind of fascinating. So as far as our guest cast here, we have Leon Askin as Ferdinand, who would go on to be the German general in Hogan's Heroes.
There you go.
And he's back as another character in season 3. This is a running theme as we do our guest cast breakdown. Most people have been on and will be back again, but always as different characters. Joseph Forte as Professor Adams. Philip Van Zandt as Reagan. He was in Crime Wave in season 1. He'll be back for another episode in season 3. And John Harmon as Skinny. He was Mousy in Runaway Robot in season 1, and he'll be back as another character in season 3.
Yeah, he was in 2 Star Trek episodes. 2 of my favorites. One was A Piece of the Action, where he plays one of the mobsters. It's one of the comedy episodes of the series, and City on the Edge of Forever is another one. And I remember his payoff is when I think what happens is that somebody beams up or beams down, and he's on this planet where, he's supposed to be, obviously of his time. And I just remember him going, "Mother," when Spock beams in or beams out or whatever, it's just a funny comedic bit.
Nice. This episode made possible in part by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is based in the South Jersey area and is looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They're also looking for comic shops to explore, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZL Comics to see their latest comic pickups and shop adventures. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of 2 of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. So we'll do our scene by scene or beat by beat breakdown here. Now, we've hit on a lot already, so in those instances, I'll move a little bit faster. But we open at Project X, this restricted area, and this scene with the scientists that we've talked about where they're in crisis, and there's this discussion about who's going to try to go in. It's all this business about removing one of the rods and inserting it in a different port to avert the disaster.
Right.
And so that's our kickoff here. And then at the Daily Planet, we have this Ferdinand character who stops Jim in the hallway.
Right.
And yeah, the gist of it with this guy apparently is that he's this press agent. He wants a story done in the paper about his country's crown jewels, which are being flown in for some sort of display or exhibit, presumably in Metropolis. So he tries to pitch this to Jim. Jim kind of brushes him off. And then Ferdinand follows Jim into Clark's office where Clark and Lois are listening to this unfold. As much as I identify completely when you laid out the differences in Lois Lane and all of that. We've been talking about it, and I'm experiencing it episode after episode. But Lois does have a great moment here where she shushes Ferdinand, where when they're trying to listen, she's like, quiet. I was like, all right, there we go.
Yeah.
there's Lois. Yeah. And then, of course, Clark sneaks off and changes into Superman and shows up. And that's where we have that sequence. And I don't know that there's anything much more to say that we haven't already laid out. But again, I think just a very effective sequence and just kind of seeing him sweat literally and figuratively in that way. And he sold it.
And it's loud too. I mean, it's a psh, 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 all these noises. It's a lot of the reason I wanted to do this episode is because I love that scene. And I love what he goes through to do what he needs to do. And of course, the aftermath is really fun too. But that was a big selling point for me.
It's not dissimilar, and boy, I might be mixing up episodes here. I apologize. But season 1, is it the Crime Wave episode where at the end he's in that chamber and he's being bombarded by the electricity and he plays possum at the end? I can't remember if it's that episode particularly. But one of the season 1 episodes, right, had that. And a similar type of thing, man. He sells it because it's like it's just him in this room, like moving around like it, and you buy it. And when he comes out, and I know we talked about this, where he asks for the Geiger counter, and then they turn off the lights, and he's glowing, and I think the effect works, and it's great. But like we were saying, there's this, you feel the toll of it. Like you do feel his frustration, but you also get the sense like, boy, this took a lot out of him.
Yeah, he's depleted.
He's really depleted. So I thought, again, really, really very effective in that respect. So next we're back at the Deadly Planet, and Jim gets a call and he brings Lois back in, and Lois talks to quote unquote Clark, right? But of course we see Superman in this cabin. And I guess the word has already gotten out that Superman has removed himself because he's radioactive. And like I said in my synopsis, then the scientists bring this up, unknown at this point if this is reversible. So of course, as the audience, you figure it'll probably be all right. But this is really putting some meat on the bone here. It's not like, oh, okay, he's been exposed to kryptonite, he'll feel better in a little while.
And they keep trying to come up with these solutions from various baffled scientists, both in the United States and elsewhere. They go to Vienna, which is, shorthand for, genius, scientists in Europe. And they keep coming up with things, and he's getting increasingly skeptical that anything is going to work. But
Lois has a crack at Clark. She makes a remark about him hiding in an air raid shelter.
Right. Yeah.
So, which again is a theme here. We'll have something very similar at the start of Panic in the Sky in a few episodes, where there's a crack about it. He's probably hiding in some basement somewhere while this asteroid is approaching. And Clark's cover story essentially is that he's following the Superman story, right? Which Lois really doesn't quite buy, and it really is this whole question about like, how can you not be here unless you're also Superman?
Right. That's where I think the episode falls down, because whenever. Let's you separate the two aspects of the whole Superman, Lois, Jimmy, Clark, Perry dynamic of the glasses are what the glasses are what disguises him, which is we all know is nonsense. But if you're accepting a world in which his glasses would actually throw them off the scent, what other reason would they have to come up with to think that Clark and Superman are the same guy? And it goes back to that whole theory that we saw in another episode of it's the stolen costume, the other guy. I always assume you have one character saying, "What do you mean the other guy? He's Superman." Because a reasonable assumption is that he is Superman all the time. Why would he need a secret identity? We have no reason to understand that. So what you have here is this again, oh, Clark, you might be Superman. And it's like, it's really in its own way forced, because if you could accept the fact that they would look at him and not see him as Superman in the face. And there have been episodes where he actually isn't wearing glasses and they don't recognize him. And it's like, okay, but they accept him as different people on the face of it. But at the same time, then they're suspicious. But it always hits a false note for me in these particular cases, because actually this is where it was, I think, written more for kids than all ages, is that Clark's rationale of trying to track down Superman and where he's gone is a legitimate line of inquiry to follow for a journalist. What happened to Superman? Where is he? What is he doing? And to try to track him down, he didn't need to. He really tries to oversell that whole point. And you start to think, oh my God, they're going to find out. They're going to find out. But it's like, really all they need to do is say, "Low," and he's like, when am I going to hear from you again? You go, I don't know. He's really not selling at this point. What you want to see is, I'm on his trail. I want to see if he's okay. You'll hear from me. I'll check in tomorrow. And that would have been that. But this is where the unnecessary tension of that has to be entered into the story.
I agree. And then wait till we get to the very final exchange in this episode, which really kind of annoyed me. But yeah, I agree. And I've talked about this on both podcasts, right? Just the idea of like why people would even assume that Superman has a secret identity. Right. And I guess, my headcanon, and clearly when we get to these episodes now in season 2 and beyond, where the characters suspect him, and there are episodes coming up, I know, where Jimmy and Lois try to prove it.
Right.
That just kind of blows my headcanon out of the water, because my headcanon, and for this show in particular, is that they know. Like, they just know, but they go along with this.
Right. But so Commissioner Gordon knows Batman is Bruce Wayne.
Exactly. That sort of thing, which in my head makes more sense. But again, clearly we will get specific instances that just undermine that. And I think, and look, I don't mean to nitpick or overanalyze this. And I know, again, this was made for a different audience at a different time. I get it, but we're here talking about it. It would have been cool if in that discussion, if Lois knows or really thinks she knows that Clark is Superman, if maybe she kind of expresses to Clark, boy, I really hope Superman's okay.
Yeah.
But she knows she's telling Superman that. Yeah. And if it had been played more for that, as opposed to, well, you must be Superman.
Right.
It's like, again, that's not what this was built for, but that's, as I'm watching it, I'm like, that's the missed opportunity. Like, that's what would have, I think, really been genuinely compelling.
You're right. The implication. But they were never that nuanced about the Clark Lois Superman triangle on the show. So.
Right. It also becomes one of those things where, we look at other iterations of the Superman legend, and I guess probably the spiritual successor most directly to the show Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, which then gets into the love story. And, a similar kind of thing there with this whole dual identity and the love triangle. Right. But then eventually she finds out. And I think that's one of the things that's, I imagine might get a little frustrating as we make our way forward with the show season by season, is that there's never any payoff to this, right? Like, there can't be. And so, and I feel that as I'm watching this. I'm just like, okay, we're just kind of spinning our wheels with this. But in any event, there's that conversation. And then we have Superman sad at the cabin, and these beats that we've already talked about where, he hangs up the phone. Yeah. And then you see the radioactive fingerprints.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the residue. Yeah.
On the phone, and turns out the light, and he's glowing, and he goes outside, and that's where, again, he's looking at his hands, and he hangs his head. And again, you've not seen him really like this before. No. So it's again, that I think really said a lot and was effective. Then we're back into this business with Ferdinand. So he goes to the bad guys, the Reagan and Skinny. And so essentially his plot is, I guess he is from this other country, and he's managing the arrival of these crown jewels, but he's a turncoat, I suppose. And he tells them that, he's like, I told the papers that they're coming by ship, but they're really coming by plane.
Right.
Right. And he's trying to rope these guys into knocking it off and stealing these jewels. And the guy's like, no, like, we have Superman here. Like, I'm not messing with that. And that's when Ferdinand shows him, I guess this guy is not really plugged into current events, because I feel like it's like a big deal. They almost had like this nuclear explosion and Superman's out of commission.
Yeah. Well, it also shows you the different time that he had to get it from the paper.
Yes. Yeah. He shows them the paper, and that now gets the wheels turning of like, oh, okay, now we can actually make a go of this. Then we see Superman again at the cabin. He's reading the books that the scientist has sent him. They have a conversation. And this is where the theory is floated that will ultimately pay off later in the episode with the lightning, that there needs to be this shock that will counter the radioactivity in his body. So we're kind of planting that seed for later here. And this is where, again, you see him testing out his current status, putting his hand over the plants, and you see them withering and dying, which, again, really effective the way they pulled that off. So, I mean, I guess really at this point now we're into more of our standard Adventures of Superman episode fare, where Ferdinand shows up at the Daily Planet and is trying to get Lois to buy into the story here about the crown jewels. And at first, like you said, she's like, well, it's nothing to do with this. She's got bigger things on her mind. But ultimately, she kind of snaps back into it. And it's like, okay, like, well, I'll go with you. And then she's brought into the car and the other two guys are there. And I'll be honest, the show ultimately, they won me back because for a minute there, I'm like, what possible reason would they have to take Lois?
Right.
But then they do explain it. So there's this idea that Superman, right now, he's staying away because he's radioactive. He doesn't want to infect anybody. But if there were this hijacked plane, he might disregard that to stop the bad guys. He might not care. But if Lois were there, then he would still keep his distance. So that's the reason. So I was like, oh, okay. Because at first I was like, what are we doing here?
Right.
But it worked. We'll go with that. We don't get to see the hijacking of the plane. None of that all happens off screen.
No, we just see her getting kidnapped.
But
Which I also like the fact that they're driving along and she's in the backseat in between these two guys and she screams.
I know.
Yeah, as if anybody would possibly hear her, Ah! But it's TV acting of the 1950s.
TV, and I guess it's maybe a natural reflex, but I had the same thought. Again, if this had been on the street as they were shoving her into the car, okay, then it makes sense.
Right.
But in the car,
mate, yeah.
So Superman's back at the cab, and again, his frustration here, like he can't intervene to save her.
Mm-hmm.
And he has that conversation where he's like, what can I do?
Right.
So you really do feel his frustration in this respect. But then he hears the weather report about the lightning and the thunderstorm.
Yeah.
And you see the wheels turning here.
Yeah.
And this is where we get the sequence you described where he flies up into the storm and you see him flying and he's glowing, and the lightning hits him. And then you see that glowing effect subside.
Yeah.
I thought they pulled it off well.
Yeah, no, they do. They do. And it's fun to see the lightning, hitting. I don't think it ever shows him hitting him, but it shows him hitting around him. And then again, when he catches up to the plane and he grabs the end of the plane and basically forces it down, I was like, all right, well, this is Superman, because you don't always get on this show, you don't always get the set piece. You get Superman using his powers, but frequently it's him bursting through a wall and people shooting at him, bouncing off his chest, and then he grabs them and coconuts them,
Yes.
But in this case, there's actually we get to see. It reminds me of the old Superman comic cover. It tickles. Where he's being hit by lightning and everything, and then you get to see him rescue the plane, and then of course we get to the big. I don't know if it's. I guess it's more the denouement than anything else.
Yeah, so this isn't a case where like he rips off the door of the plane and he goes inside. Right. It's like he's messing with the tail, and then they're like, oh, okay, we have to land in this field. And when they land, the sheriff boards the plane, and he explains that it was Superman who gave them a rough ride, right, and caused them to land. Yeah. So the bad guys are apprehended, and then who shows up but Clark Kent?
Right.
And then we get this final exchange between Lois and Clark, and Clark has this whole because where have you been and all that, and Clark says something about, well, Superman had things to do and I had things to do, right? Something to that effect. And this final exchange of, I wonder. And he goes, it's no wonder you wonder. You're a wonderful girl.
Yeah.
I just felt, I didn't like that ending.
Yeah, it was, again, this whole, if he had just simply stuck to the basic story, and I'm not talking about in story. I'm talking about if the storytelling had him sticking to the basic story, that none of that would have been, it would have been, I was following behind because I was this, or Superman, blah, 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 blah. And it didn't require the cute. It didn't require that coy. And she is kind of looking at him like she believes him, but she doesn't. And there's that, it's just, they're basically playing up a trope, but you're right. It rings hollow, and him with the kind of creepy faux flirting that he does there, but you're a wonderful girl. And he's got a guy, all of that, again, it felt unnecessary to the rest of the story, but they have to end it with a wink somehow.
I know. It felt, here's the thing. And I get the sense, I know you're a fan of this episode. I don't hate this episode, to be clear. And I think this is one that fans generally gravitate towards. And I get it. Again, to be clear, I think the setup is great. It's just kind of this payoff, and not to harp on it, but it just like this ending and just this whole thread about the identity, it just feels tonally dissonant because we're set up with these really high stakes. The idea that Superman would have to stay away forever.
Right. Yeah.
And so to go from that, where this heightened emotion and you're buying into it, to this like really flip cutesy thing about you're a wonderful girl.
Yeah.
Again, it just feels off, and it doesn't feel like that's not what this episode was about.
No.
And I feel like they could have stuck the landing, no pun intended, right? In a different way that would have made it feel more cohesive. So that was just kind of the problem that I had with this.
Sure.
But
I
overall,
mean, those are all reasonable
cool.
points. Yeah.
But it's a good look. And it's the sort of thing where, was this episode everything I wanted from start to finish? No, but it's again, there's a lot about it that's really interesting, really well done. And it's definitely an episode that if someone had not seen the show, they take a look at this because it's a cool one. All right. So the last thing we do is we rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 fedoras. How many would you give this one?
Oh, I'd give it 3.5 to 4.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good solid episode. I really do like the ending. I do like the fact that it has more set pieces beyond, again, him breaking into a wall and getting shot at and having the bullets bounce off him. There's other Superman-ish things for him to do, and I always appreciated when the show would kind of push more toward that, as opposed to just he's got these powers, he takes on a lot of gangsters. This added something to that. I like the special effects, I think, are solid, and in this case, Lois and Jimmy are more they're more the typical supporting cast as opposed to what we see in certain other episodes, but that's fine. No, I think it's a good, solid episode. I think that I would lean toward 4. 4. Yeah, we can call it a 4, but it's a soft 4.
Okay.
Let's put it that
All
way.
right. Fair enough. Yeah, for me, I'm going to go 3 for this one for the reasons we talked about. And I recognize, this was a show that was not built really to mine the emotional lives of the characters in the way that we'll see elsewhere. And so that's why I think it hits a little bit of a roadblock at a certain point, and it only has so many places to go. And that's why it goes in the direction it does. But we mentioned Panic in the Sky, and in a weird way, this is kind of almost like a fascinating kind of test run for what we would get there with a similar type of setup. Yeah. But I'm excited to get to that episode and get into all of that. So 3 fedoras for me. All right, so you're going to be back next week. We're going to talk about A Ghost for Scotland Yard. So
I know.
I'm excited to have
such timing,
back-to-back episodes with
I know. You. I hope your listeners don't get sick of me.
Definitely not. I'm sure they'll be happy to have you back here. So 13thdimension.com. Anything in particular you want to recommend to folks or mention?
Yeah, I mean, just come check us out every week. On Mondays we do our hot picks, which basically are recommendations of the types of comics that you'd like to read. As always, there's kind of a lean toward retro and vintage material, facsimile editions, trade collections and the like. But that's also a very that's a very popular feature. And another one that's coming up, our monthly Bronze Age Bonanza for I'm not sure what month this is going to run in. But that's we've got another one of those in the hopper, and that's where we take a column once a month and take the best covers of the top 13 covers of that month 50 years earlier, and just basically rank them and make jokes.
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, I encourage everyone to check it out. Come back next week for another discussion with Dan, and until then, remember, only Superman can do super things. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Many of you have already used this code, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey, a weekly exploration of Superman's vast 85-year mythology, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.